let's unpack this. Have you ever looked at a beautifully clean chart, maybe a scientific diagram, and felt like, you finally understood something incredibly complex?
Yeah, that feeling of clarity, it's really satisfying, isn't it?
Totally, like you finally got a handle on it. But what if I told you that sometimes those very tools, those elegant maps, those rigorous-looking visualizations might actually be subtly misleading us?
Misleading is about what they're trying to describe.
Exactly, about the true nature of it.
Okay, interesting.
Today we're taking a deep dive into a fascinating piece by Harris. It's titled The Two Dogmas of Complexity Science: Why Our Best Tools Mislead Us.
Harris, right. I know his work.
Yeah, he's a lifelong learner, really passionate about reflection, exploration. Through his writing, he shares insights on cybernetics, systems thinking, lean statistics, a lot of interconnected fields.
Very thoughtful stuff.
And he's an active member of CyberSyn. That's a vibrant community with exclusive resources, books, podcasts, forums.
A great space for these kinds of discussions.
Definitely. His work really challenges us, makes us think more deeply about the tools we use to understand the world, especially when it comes to complexity.
So what's our mission for this deep dive then?
Good question.
Well, our mission today is to really explore what Harris identifies as these two fundamental dogmas, the ones deeply embedded in complexity science.
Okay. Dogmas. Sounds serious.
Well, they are, in a way. Because these aren't just abstract ideas, you see. They profoundly shape how we create tools, how we design interventions in, say, organizations.
Right.
And how we understand the very fabric of organizational life. And often we don't even realize the subtle influence these assumptions have.
They're working under the surface.
Exactly. So we'll try to uncover why these dogmas don't just limit our understanding, but actually actively mislead us about what complexity truly is, and maybe more importantly, how it actually emerges.
How it comes about in the first place.
Right. This deep dive should really make us question the very foundations of how we approach complex problems. It's about shifting our perspective, maybe, from seeing complexity as something out there.
To seeing it as something we actively participate in.
Precisely. That's the core idea.
That sounds like a really powerful shift. So to start, Harris uses a specific tool, right, as a kind of case study in this potential misdirection.
He does. Let's begin with a prime example he uses to illustrate his points. It's something called Ashby space.
Ashby space.
Imagine a chart that, at first glance looks incredibly scientific, rigorous, almost mathematical in how it's presented.
I can picture it. Clean lines, axes.
Exactly. It's the kind of visualization that promises clear, objective insights into complex systems. It gives us that satisfying feeling like we've got a precise diagnostic handle on a really tricky situation.
So what does the seductive chart, as you called it, what does it actually show us or claim to show us?
Good question. It aims to map organizational viability. So picture a two-dimensional graph, simple X and Y axis. The Y-axis represents the variety of stimuli, basically how much complexity the environment presents to a system.
So like challenges, changes, signals from outside.
Exactly. Market volatility, regulatory shifts, competitive pressures, all that stuff. The amount of differentness coming at the system.
Got it. And the X-axis.
That represents the variety of responses. So how much capacity a system has to respond to that complexity.
Its internal capabilities.
Right. The diverse actions, strategies, or capabilities it possesses. Think operational flexibility, skill diversity in teams, decision-making agility, that sort of thing.
Okay, stimuli versus responses, environment versus system. Makes sense.
And within this space, this graph, there are usually three broad zones depicted.
Zones.
Yeah. In the bottom left, where both environmental stimuli and internal responses are low, you have the ordered zone. Things are routine, predictable there.
Okay, simple stuff.
Then, moving towards the middle, as variety increases on both axes, we enter the complexes zone. This is where the system needs to learn, adapt to changing conditions.
More challenging, needs flexibility.
Right. And finally, in the top right corner, where the environmental variety way outstrips the system's response capacity. That's the chaotic zone.
Overwhelm.
Exactly. The system is overwhelmed, simply unable to cope. Too much coming in, not enough ways to deal with it.
Okay, so it paints this picture, this map, of where an organization stands in relation to its environment. And you mentioned this chart also features a famous concept.
It does. Really central to it. Cutting right through the middle of this chart, usually at a 45-degree angle, there's a diagonal line.
The diagonal, what's that?
That line represents Ross Ashby's famous law of requisite variety.
Ashby again, requisite variety.
Yes. And the law states, quite powerfully that only variety can absorb variety.
Only variety can absorb variety. Okay, unpack that a bit.
It means, basically, if a system faces more environmental complexity, more variety than it has the capacity to respond to, then it's operating above that diagonal line.
Heading towards chaos.
Heading towards overwhelm, towards chaos? Yes. It simply doesn't have enough internal variety, enough different responses to match the external demands.
And above the line.
Conversely, if a system has excess capacity, its internal variety is greater than the environmental demands it's facing, then it's operating below the line. Maybe it's over-resourced, or the environment is simpler than it's prepared for.
That sounds incredibly intuitive and practical, like a really clear principle for managing complexity. So how might an organization typically use this framework?
Well, Harris explains it from a, let's say, conventional viewpoint. An organization might use this framework pretty straightforwardly to figure out where they are on the map.
Right, like a diagnostic.
Exactly. Management could try to quantify things like market volatility, regulatory changes, competitive pressures, the y-axis stuff.
Okay, put a number on it somehow.
Yeah, try to measure it. And then plot that against their internal response capabilities, their decision processes, skill diversity, operational flexibility, the x-axis stuff.
And then see where they land on the chart.
Right. They might conclude, for instance, that if they find themselves in the chaotic zone, up in that top right, well, they need to do something.
Like what?
Either increase their internal variety to match the external complexity.
Get more flexible, learn new skills.
Diversify teams, implement more agile strategies, yeah. Or maybe they might try to simplify their environment.
How would they do that?
Better filtering, maybe? Clear strategic focus, more deliberate choices about which parts of the environment to engage with, kind of reduce the incoming variety.
It truly appears to be such a precise diagnostic tool. It seems to offer such clear questions. Are we overwhelmed? Do we have enough response capacity? Should we simplify our environment or complexify our organization? It feels like a roadmap, a clear path to understanding and action.
It does feel that way.
I get the sense you're about to tell us that this seeming clarity, this precision, is precisely where the problem begins.
You've hit on the crucial point. That's exactly where Harris's insight comes in and really challenges our conventional understanding. This chart, Ashby space, and indeed many frameworks like it in complexity science, they rest on two fundamental dogmas. Deep assumptions that have shaped the field, maybe since its beginning.
Right, the two dogmas from the title.
Exactly. And these dogmas, Harris argues, don't just limit our understanding. They actively mislead us.
How so?
They mislead us about what complexity actually is and how it emerges. They subtly guide us down this path of seeking objective measurements and static maps.
When the reality is
Much more nuanced, more relational, more dynamic, not something you can just pin down on a chart so easily.
Okay, so tell us about the first of these dogmas. What is it and why is it so problematic according to Harris?
The first dogma is called ontological complexity realism.
Ontological complexity realism. Okay, big words. What does that mean in plain English?
It's the deeply ingrained belief, often unconscious, that complexity is an intrinsic, objective property of systems.
Intrinsic, meaning?
Meaning it exists independently out there in the world, regardless of who is observing it. It's just a feature of the thing itself.
Like saying a mountain is inherently tall. That's the example you used earlier.
Exactly. It's inherently tall, a fixed measurement. Or that the temperature is objectively hot or cold without needing a thermometer or a person feeling it. This dogma basically says complexity is just a feature of the world waiting to be discovered, measured, and charted, like finding a new element.
That makes sense intuitively, though, doesn't it? We usually talk about complex systems, complex problems. We assume complexity is a thing we can point to and analyze.
We do. It feels natural. But Harris argues this is where the foundational error lies.
How so?
We'll take the Ashby space chart again. It treats that variety of stimuli on the y-axis as if it were an objective quantity in the environment, something just sitting there waiting to be measured and plotted.
Right, like counting the number of different kinds of birds in a forest.
Kind of, but Harris emphasizes that variety does not exist out there in any objective sense like that.
It doesn't.
No. What counts as variety depends entirely on the distinctions made by the observer or by the system itself. Yes. The environment doesn't contain variety like a box contains objects. Instead, variety emerges through the interaction, or better, the coupling between the system and its environment. And it's mediated by the system's capacity for making distinctions.
Okay, hold on. This is making me pause and think. So A stimulus isn't just an external event happening. It's something we, or the system, make into a stimulus by how we perceive it, by how we categorize it.
That's the core idea. It's not a pre-existing state. It's an outcome of a specific kind of relationship, a specific way of seeing.
Can you give us a concrete example to really bring this idea to life? It feels quite abstract right now.
Absolutely. Let's use an example Harris brings up, sort of expanding on it. Imagine you're sitting in a hospital emergency room. Maybe you're there because a loved one is being cared for.
Okay. Stressful situation.
Very. Now, from your perspective as a family member, maybe someone without medical training, it might feel like utter chaos, right?
Definitely. Alarms, people rushing, jargon.
Exactly. Alarms blaring. Doctors and nurses rushing between rooms with urgent expressions, medical terms flying around that you don't understand, life and death decisions seemingly happening at bewildering speed. You're probably overwhelmed by a seemingly infinite number of signals and events.
Feeling helpless, yeah.
Right. Feeling utterly unprepared to respond effectively.
Yeah.
The variety here seems immense, maybe infinite from your viewpoint.
Okay.
But now, consider the experienced ER physician standing right beside you, dealing with the exact same environment.
Right. Their experience is different.
Totally different. They hear a specific alarm, and they know exactly what it signifies, which machine, which patient, what potential problem. They recognize the rhythm of triage protocols. They understand the medical terminology. They see familiar patterns that guide their actions, their interventions.
So what's chaos to me is information to them.
Or manageable complexity, at least.
Yeah.
What seems like chaos to the family member registers as something they can navigate for the physician. Why? Because their training and experience allow them to make crucial distinctions.
They can filter, categorize, prioritize.
Precisely. They simplify, organize, and give meaning to the environment in a way the untrained observer cannot. So here the punchline Harris is getting at. The complexity is not inherent in the ER itself. It emerges from the coupling between the medical environment and each observer's capacity for distinction making.
Wow, okay. It's not a fixed quantity in the room. It's relational. It depends on who is looking and what they can distinguish.
Exactly. Is brought forth by the observer, by their specific coupling with that environment.
That's a powerful distinction, really eye-opening. It completely changes how I think about objective reality in these kinds of complex situations. But Harris also extends this observer dependence to the other axis, right? The variety of responses, the x-axis.
It does.
How does that work? I mean, if I have a certain set of skills or tools or available actions, aren't those objectively my response variety? It feels like I could list them out.
That's a great question, and it touches on the same core misunderstanding. Harris argues that what counts as variety of responses also depends entirely on the distinctions an observer or the system itself can make about available actions.
So my perception of my options matters.
Critically, the same ER situation we just discussed reveals entirely different response repertoires to different observers, even among the professionals.
Okay, give me examples.
Well, the family member we talked about, they might perceive only binary options, panic, or wait helplessly. They feel they have almost zero effective response variety.
Right. Limited distinctions lead to limited perceived options.
Exactly. Now, a nurse in that same situation sees a much richer array of possible interventions, adjusting medication dosages, coordinating with specialists, managing the patient's comfort, communicating with the family, accurately documenting observations, a whole range of distinct actions.
Okay, more distinctions, more perceived variety.
Now take the attending physician. They distinguish even more nuanced possibilities. Different diagnostic pathways, specific treatment protocols based on subtle symptoms, complex risk management strategies, maybe even identifying teaching moments for the residents amidst the action.
Even finer distinctions.
And then picture a hospital administrator observing the same overall situation. They see yet another set of responses, focused perhaps on resource allocation decisions, optimizing patient flow, ensuring regulatory compliance, dealing with staffing issues. Completely different distinctions, completely different perceived response variety.
So the amount of response variety isn't fixed either.
No. And here's the key insight, the punchline for the x-axis. None of these response varieties exist independently in the situation. Each emerges from the specific capacity of the observer to make distinctions about what constitutes meaningful action.
It's not just about the raw capabilities being there waiting to be counted.
Right. They are enacted. They come into being through our ability or the system's ability to differentiate one potential action from another, one possibility from another in that specific context.
So it's not just that we interpret complexity differently. It's that we actually, in a way, create it through our distinctions. both the stimuli we notice and the responses we consider possible.
That's a great way to put it. We co-create it.
This sounds like it connects to something deeper, maybe more philosophical, about how we relate to our environment. It feels less like engineering and more like epistemology.
It definitely does. And this idea isn't entirely new. Harris skillfully draws on the philosopher John Dewey here.
John Dewey, okay.
Dewey understood this profound insight way back. He argued that organism and environment must be understood transactionally rather than merely interactionally.
Transactionally versus interactionally, what's the difference?
Well, traditional thinking, as Harris explained it, often assumes a distinct organism here and a separate environment there, and then we study how they interact across that assumed boundary.
Right, like two billiard balls hitting each other.
Kind of. But Dewey argued this very separation is an abstraction, a conceptual cut we make that obscures the primary reality.
What is she?
The ongoing transaction between organism and environment that constitutes experience itself. It's a continuous, interwoven process. The boundaries aren't fixed or given. They're fluid and constantly co-defined within the activity itself.
A transaction, like a continuous exchange maybe, not just separate things bumping into each other.
Exactly. And the key insight from Dewey, which Harris highlights, is that stimulus and response are not external to each other. They're not separate events in a chain.
They're not.
No. Dewey said they are always inside a coordination and have their significance purely from the part played in maintaining or reconstituting the coordination.
Okay, that's a bit dense. Can you break that down?
Think about it this way. The stimulus isn't something that just happens to the organism from the outside world. Instead, Dewey says it's something to be discovered, something to be made out.
So the organism is actively seeking or defining the stimulus.
Yes. And crucially, it's the motor response, which assists in discovering and constituting the stimulus. The action helps create the perception.
Wow. So the action isn't just a reaction to the stimulus, it helps define what the stimulus even is.
Precisely. Harris uses Dewey's example, I think, of a bird flying. We tend to think the bird is here responding to air currents there. But Dewey would say bird and air currents are abstractions we make. The more fundamental reality is bird flying in air, a single, unified transaction.
The boundaries are drawn by us, the observers.
Right. Not inherently given in the phenomena itself. Dewey put it very concisely. The stimulus is that phase of the forming coordination which represents the conditions which have to be met. The response is that phase, which gives the key to meeting these conditions. They are two aspects of one single ongoing coordination.
That's a profound thought. It really shifts our whole understanding of knowledge, doesn't it? It stops being about a mind passively mirroring an external world that's already perfectly formed and just waiting for us.
Exactly. It becomes much more active, much more dynamic, a constant shaping process.
Knowledge isn't just reception, it's construction.
Precisely. In this transactional view, knowledge emerges from the transaction between organism and environment. It's not about copying something pre-existing out there.
So what we call objective facts are
Stable patterns that arise in our ongoing transactions with our surroundings. Patterns that prove useful, reliable for our purposes. And crucially, Harris emphasizes, echoing Dewey, this construction of knowledge isn't just happening inside the organism's head. It concerns the process all the way around. It's fundamentally relational.
Okay, so how does this transactional view apply back to the Ashby space chart and complexity science?
Well, applied to complexity science, Dewey's transactionalism really reveals why Ashby space, when used conventionally, falls short. It highlights the flaw in that first dogma.
Because the chart treats stimuli and responses as separate things.
Exactly. It treats variety of stimuli and variety of responses as if they were separate, independently measurable quantities that you can just plot on axes. But Harris emphasizes, drawing on Dewey, that these are abstractions from the ongoing transaction.
They're cuts we make in a continuous flow.
Right. There's no objective variety out there just waiting to be counted, and no predefined set of responses in here waiting to be cataloged independently of the situation. There is only the ongoing transaction through which sifter and environment mutually specify each other.
Constantly defining and redefining what counts as variety and response in that moment.
Yes. The map assumes a separation where there is only continuous mutual constitution. And in doing so, it misses the very essence of how complexity is brought forth in the first place.
Fascinating. Okay, so the first dogma, ontological complexity realism, assumes complexity is an objective, measurable property out there, and the transactional view shows the flaw in that. What's the second dogma, then, and how does it build on this foundational misunderstanding?
The second dogma is what Harris calls epistemological representationalism.
Epistemological representationalism.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Epistemology is about knowledge, right? How we know things.
Correct. So this dogma is about how we think we come to know complexity. It's the belief that our primary task as scientists or observers or managers of complex systems is to discover and measure this supposedly pre-existing complexity.
The complexity assumed by the first dogma.
Exactly. The goal becomes developing ever better methods and tools, better charts, better algorithms, better sensors, with the ultimate aim of creating objective, accurate maps of how the world really is.
Like a perfect mirror of reality.
Precisely. And the Ashby chart, with its clean boundaries between the ordered, complex, and chaotic zones, its precise 45-degree diagonal line, its seemingly measurable axis, it presents itself as exactly such a neutral, objective representation.
It implicitly promises us a direct, unmediated view. Like we can just read the complexity off the chart.
Yes. It feels like it's mapping objective territory, doesn't it? Rather than, say, constructing a potentially useful conceptual tool. It feels like an authoritative truth, a definitive answer to where an organization stands.
I see. It definitely looks that way. Very convincing.
But Harris points out that the moment you actually try to use this framework in a practical real-world setting, well, its representational claims start to break down. Pretty quickly, actually.
How so? What happens when you try to apply it?
He challenges us to ask some basic questions, like, where precisely would you locate a specific organization on these coordinates? How would you actually objectively measure variety of stimuli independently of how that specific system perceives and distinguishes things in its environment?
Right. Back to the observer dependence.
Exactly. And equally, how would you even define variety of responses without already deciding what constitutes meaningfully different actions or capabilities for that system in that context? The categories aren't just given.
You have to make judgments, interpretations?
You do. The chart simply cannot answer these fundamental questions because it treats as measurable quantities things that are actually dynamic processes of distinction-making.
It tries to make a static picture of something fluid.
Yes. It attempts to provide a static map of what can, in reality, only be enacted through the ongoing interplay, the transaction, between an observer or system and their environment. It presents a fixed picture of something that is inherently fluid, relational, and constantly being co-created.
This sounds very similar, again, to what Maturana and Varela talked about with living systems, autopoiesis, structural coupling. Does Harris connect to their work here as well?
He absolutely does. It fits perfectly. Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela's seminal work on structural coupling provides another strong argument for why this representational approach fails.
How does their work connect?
Well, they show that living systems don't just passively represent an independent environment that's out there. Instead, they actively enact their world. They bring forth a world through their own unique structure, their organization, and their history of coupling, their history of interactions.
The world they live in is the world they create through living.
In a very real sense, yes. As Maturana famously put it, and it's such a powerful, almost startling statement to really grapple with, everything said is said by an observer to an observer.
Everything said is said by an observer. Wow.
It means the very boundaries we draw when we talk about systems and environments as separate things, these are, in fact, distinctions made by us as observers for a particular purpose. They are not objective features of a world just waiting to be mapped out.
Our act of observing, our way of knowing, shapes what we see and what we can even say about it.
Exactly. We can't step outside of that. There's no view from nowhere.
Okay, this feels like we're getting to a really deep point now. There seems to be a fundamental contradiction here, almost a philosophical one. It feels like the very act of trying to map complexity, using tools like Ashby space, might be inherently at odds with what complexity fundamentally is.
Precisely. You've nailed it. Harris argues that here lies the deeper issue, one that cuts right to the heart of what we even mean by complexity itself.
What's the contradiction?
The very notion that complexity can be objectively mapped contradicts its fundamental nature, as we understand it from complexity science itself.
How so?
Well, if something is truly complex, what does that imply? It implies emergence, unpredictability, context sensitivity, observer dependence, nonlinearity.
Right. Those are the hallmarks.
So by its nature, complexity resists reduction to static, neat, mappable coordinates. These characteristics, emergence, unpredictability, etc., aren't just annoying side effects that better measurement tools might eventually overcome. Harris argues they are definitional characteristics of complexity itself.
They're not bugs, they're features.
Exactly. To try and remove them, To map complexity onto a simple static chart is to fundamentally misunderstand and misrepresent what complexity is. You lose the very essence of it.
Yet the Ashby space chart seems to do exactly that.
It does. Ashby space and Harish suggests many similar frameworks in complexity science attempt to do exactly what complexity theory tells us should be impossible, or at least deeply problematic.
Which is?
To reduce these emergent, context-dependent, observer-enacted phenomena down to static, universal, seemingly objective coordinates on a graph.
It tries to map complexity while simultaneously denying the very characteristics that make something complex in the first place.
Perfectly put. It's a paradox embedded right there in the tool we're using to understand the phenomena.
Is this what Harish calls a performative contradiction? That sounds like a fitting term.
It is, and it's a brilliant way to frame the problem. It's a performative contradiction because the very act of creating and using the map contradicts the insights that supposedly inform it.
How does that work?
Well, we use the insights of complexity science. Insights that tell us things are emergent, relational, context-dependent, observer-involved, and then we immediately turn around and create tools, like Ashby Space, that treat those same phenomena as if they were static, separable, mappable, context-independent, and objectively observable.
We acknowledge complexity emerges from relationships.
And then we try to locate it in discrete zones on a chart, as if it were a fixed geographical feature or an element in the periodic table, completely separate from the observer and the context.
It's like arguing against gravity while holding an apple up and expecting it not to fall.
Exactly. The very act of constructing the map denies the underlying reality it claims to represent. It performs the opposite of what it preaches.
And this contradiction runs even deeper because of the observer's role.
It does, because if complexity truly emerges from this recursive coupling, this transaction between observers and their domains of inquiry, then any attempt to create a universal, objective map of complexity must necessarily fail.
Why must?
Because the map itself and the act of mapping becomes part of the system it attempts to describe. It inevitably changes the very phenomenon it seeks to represent. The observer drawing the map cannot step outside the epistemic coupling that generates the complexity in the first place.
You can't observe the system without being part of the system.
Right. You're always already implicated in its construction, which means any map is always going to be a partial, situated, observer-dependent construction. It can never be a neutral mirror of reality. It's always a perspective, shaped by the act of observing itself.
Okay. So these two dogmas, the belief in objective complexity, ontological realism, and the idea that we can objectively map it, epistemological representationalism, they're not just abstract philosophical points. You're saying they actually create concrete problems, practical difficulties in how we understand and try to manage complex systems.
Absolutely. Harish highlights that these two dogmas aren't just interesting ideas for academics to debate. They generate a whole series of persistent puzzles, real frustrations that have plagued complexity science and its practical application for decades.
Puzzles, like inconsistencies or paradoxes.
Exactly. And the crucial insight Harish offers is that these puzzles aren't typically due to inadequate methods or flawed data, as we often assume. We think, if only we had a better tool or more information.
Right.
But he argues they're actually generated by the very assumptions we bring to the study of complexity by these two dogmas. They are artifacts of our conceptual framework, rather than problems inherent in the world itself.
That's a really powerful reframing. It suggests the problems might dissolve if we change our assumptions. Can you give us some examples of these puzzles? I'm curious now how this idea of epistemic coupling helps to make sense of them.
Certainly. And yes, the idea of complexity emerging from epistemic coupling, that recursive interaction between a knowing system and its environment, really does help to dissolve many of these long-standing frustrations. Let's look at a few Harish mentions.
Okay.
First, take the classic expert-novice paradox. Why do two people, an expert and a novice, look at the exact same system or situation and see vastly different levels of complexity?
Yeah, that happens all the time. The expert sees patterns, the novice sees noise.
Right. Now, a conventional representationalist believing in objective complexity might say one of them is measuring incorrectly, or maybe the novice is just missing some crucial data. They assume there's one true level of complexity to be found.
But the epistemic coupling view says,
if complexity emerges from epistemic coupling, from the interactive process of knowing and distinguishing, then of course experts and novices enact different complexities. It's not that one is right and one is wrong.
they just have different capacities for making distinctions.
Exactly. The expert has cultivated, through years of experience and training, a much richer set of distinctions. They can perceive patterns, relationships, and nuances that are simply invisible to the novice, whose distinctions are less developed. So they literally bring forth different realities, different complexities, through their different capacities for discernment.
Okay, that makes sense of the expert-novice difference without saying one is wrong. What's another puzzle?
How about the measurement tool problem? Why do different tools or methods applied to the same system often reveal different kinds or levels of complexity?
Right. If I use a survey versus direct observation versus analyzing network data, I might get very different pictures of how complex an organization is.
Exactly. Now, representationalism hopes that better, more refined tools will eventually converge on the true complexity, revealing the single objective reality underneath.
Like getting a clearer and clearer photograph.
Kind of. But if complexity is relational, if it emerges from coupling, then different tools will necessarily enact different varieties. Why? Because they make different distinctions possible.
The tool itself shapes what you see.
Precisely. Each tool, by its very design, highlights certain aspects, filters out others, focuses attention in specific ways. It thereby constructs a particular slice, particular view of complexity. The tool isn't just passively measuring, it's actively participating in the creation of what gets measured. Different tools, different couplings, different complexities enacted.
Okay, that dissolves that puzzle too. What else?
Then there's the notorious issue of context dependency. Complexity is famous for being highly sensitive to context. What works in one situation falls flat in another.
Right. That's hard to find universal laws.
Now, realism often treats this context dependency as noise, something messy that needs to be filtered out or controlled for in experiments so we can get to the underlying context-free principles.
But the coupling perspective.
If complexity emerges from system-environment coupling, then context dependence is exactly what we should expect. It's not a flaw to be eliminated. It's a fundamental feature of the phenomena.
Because the coupling is the context.
In large part, yes. The specific conditions, the relationships, the histories of interaction, that's the stuff of coupling. It fundamentally shapes how complexity manifests. To try and remove context would be to try and remove the very conditions that allow complexity to emerge in the first place. It's baked in.
Makes sense. What about defining systems? That always feels tricky.
Ah, yes, the boundary definition crisis. I think you mentioned finding it difficult yourself. Where does a complex system actually begin and end? The harder you try to draw a precise, objective boundary around it, the more arbitrary and artificial it feels.
Totally. Is the team the system? The department? The whole organization? The organization plus its key suppliers feels like you can always zoom in or out.
Exactly. Harris highlights this not as a mere technical problem that we just need better methodology to solve. He sees it as a fundamental issue, revealing the constructed nature of systems themselves.
So boundaries aren't real out there.
They are not inherent features of reality just waiting to be discovered. They are conceptual distinctions made by us as observers for particular purposes. We draw a boundary to focus our attention, to make analysis possible. They are essential tools for understanding, but they are our lines drawn on the sand, not objective demarcations given in the world itself.
Okay, so the fuzziness of boundaries is also a feature, not a bug, from this perspective. What about interventions? That seems like a really practical one.
Yes, and perhaps the most frustrating one for practitioners. The intervention prediction failure. Why do interventions, even those carefully designed based on our detailed complexity mappings and models, so often produce unexpected, sometimes counterintuitive results?
Yeah, the law of unintended consequences seems to rule in complex systems. We draw up a brilliant plan based on our Ashby space map, maybe. We implement it, and the system just goes off in a completely different direction.
Exactly. Now, if complexity were truly objective and accurately mappable, like the chart suggests, our interventions should be far more predictable, shouldn't they? We should be able to engineer outcomes more reliably.
You'd think so.
But, as Harris argues, viewing complexity as epistemic coupling explains why prediction is so hard. Any intervention we make isn't just acting on an external, static system depicted on our map.
It changes the system.
It changes the coupling. It changes the observer-system relationship itself. Our intervention becomes a new stimulus, prompting new responses, forcing new distinctions, altering the ongoing transaction.
So the map becomes outdated the moment we act based on it.
In a fundamental way, yes, because the act of intervening changes the very dynamic that creates the complexity we were trying to address, often in ways we simply cannot foresee from our static map. The system reconfigures itself around our action.
Wow. So the crucial takeaway from all these dissolved puzzles is what?
The crucial takeaway Harish emphasizes is this. These puzzles persist not because of inadequacies in our methods or measurements, but because they are generated by the assumptions, the two dogmas we bring to complexity science.
Our foundational assumptions, ontological realism and epistemological representationalism, are the source of the persistent confusion and frustration.
Exactly. Change the assumptions, embrace the idea of complexity as enacted through epistemic coupling, and the puzzles transform from problems to be solved into features to be understood.
That's a really profound shift in thinking. It makes me circle back to something on that Ashby chart again. After recognizing this fundamental contradiction and how observer-dependent everything is, I wonder about viability.
Ah, yes. Viability.
Where exactly would you point on that map to show that a system is viable? The framework sort of suggests it should be below that diagonal line in the ordered or complex zones, right? Where response variety meets or exceeds stimulus variety.
That's the conventional interpretation, yes.
But if everything's stimular, responses, complexity itself is observer-dependent and enacted, how can viability be an objective location on the map?
That's an excellent question.
Yeah.
And it's precisely where the framework, when taken literally as an objective map, really struggles. It hits a wall.
Why? What's the conventional idea of viability?
Conventionally, viability refers to a system's ability to maintain its essential variables within acceptable limits while facing environmental disturbances.
Okay, like organizational survival, financial sustainability, operational effectiveness, things like that.
Exactly. Things that sound objective and measurable, like a clear goal you can aim for, a state you can achieve, and locate below that diagonal line.
But Harish argues it's not that simple.
Right. He points out that when we examine viability more closely, using this observer-dependent lens, we discover it cannot be separated from the observer, who determines what counts as essential variables and what constitutes acceptable limits.
Ah. The definition of viability itself depends on who's looking.
Precisely. Consider the example Harish gives, or one like it, a small community organization. It might be considered highly viable by its members because it successfully maintains strong social cohesion, provides mutual support, and fosters a deep sense of belonging. Those are its essential variables.
Even if it's struggling financially.
Exactly. Even if an external auditor, looking only at financial statements, sees it as completely unsustainable and non-viable according to their criteria. Conversely, think of a large corporation. It might appear incredibly viable based on its quarterly profit reports, but be considered fundamentally corrupt, unethical, or unsustainable by other observers, maybe environmental groups, or labor advocates due to its negative impact on the planet or its exploitative practices. Their definition of essential variables and acceptable limits is different.
So viability isn't a single fixed state that you can just plot on the chart. It depends on the perspective, the values, the distinctions of the observer.
Exactly. Viability, seen through this lens, emerges from the recursive process of distinction-making itself. A system becomes viable, or maintains viability, not by achieving some fixed state on a map, but through the ongoing activity of maintaining coherence in the face of perturbations.
Coherence, according to whose definition?
According to the distinctions that define that system for that observer. This coherence isn't a static state to be achieved, but a dynamic process to be sustained. It depends fundamentally on the system's capacity to continue making the distinctions that allow it to recognize itself as itself, to maintain its identity, its purpose, its defining relationships in a changing environment, as seen by a particular observer.
Okay, so the punchline regarding viability in the map is?
The punchline here is quite profound. Viability cannot be located on this map because viability is the ongoing process of maintaining coherence through the very distinction-making that makes the map possible in the first place.
Wow, it's not a zone you can point to on the chart.
No. It's the dynamic activity itself. It's the ongoing process of epistemic coupling between system and environment that allows coherence to be perceived and maintained.
So the chart, when we take it as an objective map,
it renders invisible the most crucial aspect of organizational life, which is how systems actively construct the complexity they face through their own observational and response capacities, and how they maintain coherence through that process. It treats as given, as background, what is actually the central phenomenon we need to understand and cultivate.
This is a really profound shift in perspective. It feels like we're moving beyond critique now. If we abandon these two dogmas, ontological realism and epistemological representationalism, how does it change the fundamental questions we asked about complexity? It feels like we're moving from a what is it kind of question.
To how does it happen?
Or
how is it brought forth? Kind of inquiry.
Instead of asking
how complex is this system? which, as we've seen, implicitly buys into those dogmas by assuming objective, measurable complexity out there, we might ask a much more generative, process-oriented question.
Such as?
Such as, how does complexity emerge from the recursive interaction, the coupling, between this knowing system and its environment?
That completely reframes the inquiry, doesn't it?
It does. It moves us away from trying to find static measurements and objective maps and towards understanding the dynamic process itself, towards understanding the relationship.
Understanding epistemic coupling, is that the term Harris uses?
Yes, that's the core concept he proposes. We shift our focus from measuring pre-existing complexity to understanding epistemic coupling, the dynamic, recursive process through which systems and environments mutually specify each other through ongoing interaction and distinction-making.
And complexity becomes?
Complexity becomes not a property to be measured in the system or environment, but a feature of the relationship itself, a characteristic of the coupling, something to be understood in its emergence.
What's fascinating here, as you mentioned earlier, is that Harris isn't just throwing out previous work. He's actually weaving together insights from three major, seemingly distinct traditions to build this new understanding. It's a powerful synthesis.
It really is. It shows how these ideas resonate across different fields.
Can you walk us through those three traditions again and how they contribute to this idea of epistemic coupling?
Sure. First, as we discussed quite a bit, there's Dewey's transaction theory.
Right. Organism environment as a unified field.
Exactly. Harris uses Dewey to emphasize that we shouldn't treat the organism or system and environment as separate entities that merely interact across a boundary. They form a continuous, unified transactional field.
And the stimuli and responses on the Ashby chart are just
abstractions from this ongoing unified transaction. They're conceptual cuts we make into a continuous process for analytical purposes, not independently existing elements. Dewey helps us see the undivided wholeness first.
Okay, that's the first strand. What's the second?
Second, Harris draws heavily on Maturana and Varela's concept of structural coupling, stemming from their theory of autopoiesis and living systems.
We touched on that too. Living systems enact their world.
Right. Their work shows us that living systems don't just passively represent or adapt to an environment that exists independently out there. Instead, they actively enact their world through their specific structure, their organization, and their history of coupling, their history of interactions that trigger structural changes.
So the coupling itself is the source of complexity.
Yes. The world that matters to an organism, the world it perceives and responds to, is the world it brings forth through its own living, through its own operations and distinctions, maintained through structural coupling. Complexity arises in that coupling, not just as something external to be mapped onto it.
Okay, Dewey for transaction, Maturana and Varela for structural coupling and enactment. What's the third strand?
The third strand is Ashby's cybernetics itself, particularly the law of requisite variety. But it's cybernetics seen through this new lens.
Ah, so he's reinterpreting Ashby, not rejecting him.
Exactly. Here's the crucial reinterpretation Harris offers. Before Ashby's law of requisite variety, only variety absorbs variety, can even apply, an observer, or the system acting as an observer of its environment, must first create variety through the act of distinction-making.
The law doesn't operate on raw, undifferentiated reality.
No. It requires an observer to carve up the world into meaningful categories, to decide what counts as a distinct stimulus or a distinct response in that context. Variety has to be generated first, through distinctions.
So distinction-making is more fundamental than regulation.
Yes, that's a key insight. Regulation, which is what Ashby's law is about, becomes a second-order process. It's built upon the foundation of prior distinctions that brought variety into existence in the first place. Ashby's work is thus recontextualized as a principle about how we, as observers or systems, manage the varieties we bring forth through our distinctions.
So this isn't rejecting Ashby's profound contribution at all?
Not at all. It's reinterpreting his work within this broader, more relational framework that fully acknowledges the constitutive role of the observer, the knowing system.
It transforms Ashby's focus from purely objective regulatory mechanisms
to an emphasis on the active role of the knowing system in shaping the very variety it then seeks to regulate. Instead of systems just discovering pre-existing variety out there that they must match, they actively participate in enacting the complexity they face through their own distinction-making capacities.
And the regulatory challenge emerges from and remains embedded within that ongoing transaction.
Exactly. The regulatory challenge isn't a separate technical problem to be solved just by building more response capacity based on an objective map. It arises from and remains deeply intertwined with the ongoing transaction, the epistemic coupling between the system and its environment.
This whole process, engaging deeply with a powerful tool like Ashby Space, really understanding its insights, then seeing its limitations, its hidden assumptions, and finally moving beyond its literal interpretation to a new understanding. It reminds me strongly of Ludwig Wittgenstein's idea.
Wittgenstein, how so?
His metaphor of the ladder. You use a ladder to climb up to reach a higher viewpoint, but once you're there, you have to kick the ladder away. It served its purpose to get you there, but it's not the place itself. You don't cling to the ladder.
That's a fantastic analogy. And it's precisely the method Harish advocates for dealing with these kinds of seductive but ultimately limited frameworks. He essentially lays out a journey, kind of like climbing Wittgenstein's ladder, in 5 steps.
Okay, what are the steps? How do we climb this ladder and then kick it away?
Step 1. We present the seductive chart. We start by acknowledging its appeal. We marvel at how clean and scientific Ashby Space looks, how it promises mathematical precision in mapping complexity. The axes seem objective, the zones seem real, the diagonal line looks like a law of nature. We initially buy into its apparent truth.
Okay, appreciate the tool's apparent power.
Step 2. We walk through its apparent insights. We explore what it seems to tell us. Systems in the chaotic zone do seem to lose coherence. The law of requisite variety does seem to offer clear guidance for matching internal and external complexity. It feels like a useful diagnostic and prescriptive tool. We learn from its surface logic.
Understand its conventional use and value.
Step 3. We reveal the hidden assumptions. This is where the critique begins. We start asking the hard questions. Who decides what counts as a distinct stimulus or response? How is variety actually carved up? Where is the boundary between system and environment? We realize the chart treats as given as unproblematic what are actually the most fundamental observer-dependent questions.
Question the foundation.
Step 4. We show the inevitable breakdown. We see how the chart fails when we try to apply it literally and objectively. We discover it cannot actually locate viability, because viability itself is the ongoing process of distinction-making that makes the chart possible. Every attempt at objective measurement dissolves, revealing the observer's hand. The map falls apart when we try to use it as a perfect mirror of reality.
See where the representational claim fails in practice.
Exactly. And finally, step 5. We kick away the ladder. Having climbed up through understanding and critique, we reach a new perspective. The chart reveals its true nature. Not as an objective map of complexity regimes, but as a conceptual tool, a heuristic, for thinking about epistemic coupling processes.
It becomes valuable in a different way.
Precisely. It becomes valuable exactly when we stop trying to use it representationally as if it were a direct depiction of reality and start using it as a provocation. A tool to help us understand how complexity emerges through our own acts of distinction-making, through the coupling between systems and environments. We use it to think, not to mirror.
So, the conclusion isn't that frameworks like Ashby Space are useless, or that we should just throw them out entirely. That would be like refusing to use a ladder at all.
Exactly. That's not the point.
It means we need to fundamentally change how we understand their role and how we engage with them. It's about a shift in perspective regarding the tool itself, not necessarily outright rejection.
Precisely. We need to understand them not as objective maps of complexity regimes out there, but as potentially useful tools for thinking about epistemic coupling processes, about the dynamics of interaction and distinction.
The chart becomes valuable not because it represents how organizations really are,
but because it helps us think about how systems might maintain coherence while facing varieties of challenges and opportunities, varieties that they themselves help constitute. It prompts us to consider the active construction of reality and our role within it.
Okay, so the zones on the chart, ordered, complex, chaotic, they become not objective territories that an organization is definitively in.
Right. They become more like conceptual spaces, maybe metaphors, for exploring different potential modes of system-environment interaction, different patterns of coupling.
And the adaptive frontier, that diagonal line of requisite variety.
That becomes less of a fixed law and more of a useful heuristic. A way to think about the potential limits of a system's current distinction-making capacity and the relationship between the variety it encounters and the variety it can generate. It pushes us to ask, how might we expand our distinctions? How might we refine our responses? How can we enhance the coupling?
So, used in this way, the chart really does serve as Wittgenstein's ladder.
Exactly. It's something we climb up to reach a new, more nuanced perspective on complexity as an enacted phenomenon. And then we kick it away, or at least stop leaning on it as if it were the solid ground of objective reality.
It helps us think more clearly about complexity without pretending to be complexity itself. It's a mental scaffold, like you said, a temporary aid to thought, not the ultimate building of truth.
Well put. It reminds me of something Richard Rorty might say.
Ah, another philosopher. How does Rorty fit in?
Rorty might remind us that vocabularies like Ashby's vocabulary of stimuli, responses, variety zones are just tools. They are useful in particular contexts for particular purposes. They don't have intrinsic natures, and they don't claim to carve reality at its joints or reveal some ultimate truth.
The fact that Ashby's vocabulary helps us talk about and navigate organizational challenges better than, say, some other vocabulary.
Doesn't mean that organizations objectively speak Ashby or are fundamentally structured according to that chart. It just means we've found a language, a set of distinctions, that is useful for our purposes in our context for making sense and taking action. It's pragmatic, not representational in the strong sense.
This feels really important, because this is far more than just an academic discussion about charts and philosophy, isn't it? The implications of holding on to those two dogmas, realism and representationalism, whether we realize it or not, they subtly shape how we actually design organizations, how we make decisions, how we respond to challenges in our daily lives. And often, they might be steering us in counterproductive directions.
Absolutely. They have very real consequences. For instance, holding on to these dogmas subtly encourages us to constantly search for better measurement tools. We think the problem is just a lack of precision or that we need more data, bigger data.
Believing that if we could just measure accurately enough, the true complexity would reveal itself?
Right. Instead of focusing on developing better capacities for distinction making within ourselves, within our teams, within our systems, improving our ability to see differently, to categorize differently, to perceive new possibilities.
We focus on the map, not the map maker skills.
Well said. And these dogmas focus our attention on mapping complexity, as if it were some external phenomenon to be captured, rather than on cultivating the very epistemic coupling processes, the quality of interaction, the richness of distinction, the responsiveness through which complexity actually emerges and is navigated. We end up managing the representation instead of engaging with the generative process.
And perhaps most problematically.
Most problematically, Harris argues, these dogmas implicitly suggest that complexity is something that just happens to us, something external, objective, that we are merely passive recipients of. We are victims of complexity.
Rather than
something we actively participate in creating through our distinctions, our actions, our relationships. And this framing, this assumption of passivity, deeply obscures our responsibility.
Our responsibility for the complexities we enact, for the consequences of the distinctions we choose to make or choose not to make.
Exactly. If we believe complexity is just out there, a given feature of the world, then we absolve ourselves of our fundamental role in its manifestation. We can just blame the complex environment instead of looking at how our own ways of seeing and acting are contributing to the situation.
Wow. That brings in a really profound ethical dimension to this whole discussion. It's not just about epistemology, it's about responsibility.
It absolutely is.
But looking at the flip side, understanding complexity as this enacted phenomenon, as epistemic coupling, it also opens up really exciting new possibilities, doesn't it? It shifts us from being potentially victims of complexity to being active, potentially more skillful, and certainly more responsible participants.
Absolutely. It's a much more empowering perspective, ultimately. It opens possibilities, for example, for designing systems, organizations, teams, technologies that can remain coherent and maintain their identity while staying genuinely open to surprise and novelty, rather than becoming rigid and brittle in the face of uncertainty.
Systems that can learn and adapt their distinctions.
Yes. And it focuses us on cultivating capacities for distinction-making in individuals, in groups that can expand dynamically as we encounter new kinds of variety, rather than being confined to static, predefined categories from old maps. It's about enhancing our collective ability to perceive and respond.
And crucially,
as we just touched on, it prompts us towards taking responsibility for the complexities we participate in creating, rather than simply blaming an objective external world for our challenges. It brings agency and ethics back to the center.
You mentioned Heinz von Forster earlier, another key cybernetician. Did he speak to this ethical dimension?
He did, very deeply. Von Forster understood this ethical dimension profoundly when he formulated his famous ethical imperative. It wasn't just a technical guideline, it was deeply ethical.
What was the imperative?
He said, act always so as to increase the number of choices.
Increase the number of choices. Why is that ethical?
Because if we accept that we are responsible for constructing our realities through our distinctions, if our choices about what to distinguish, what to value, what to connect, literally bring forth certain realities and possibilities while closing off others, then we are also responsible for ensuring that others can participate meaningfully in that construction. We need to consider how our actions affect the possibilities available to others.
Our models, our maps, our narratives, our organizational designs, they aren't neutral.
They are absolutely not neutral. They create constraints or they create possibilities for ourselves and for others. This perspective imbues our engagement with complexity, not just with technical challenges, but with a deep ethical weight and a constant call to mindful, responsible action. How do our distinctions affect the choices available?
What an incredible journey we've taken. We started with that Ashby chart, looking so clean, so objective, promising such clear answers about complexity and viability.
Seems so straightforward at first.
And now, what we've discovered following Hirsch's analysis is that complexity is actually much messier, far more relational, deeply participatory, and fundamentally observer-dependent than any single static representation like that can possibly capture.
It escapes the confines of the map.
And the crucial insight is that isn't some unfortunate limitation we need to overcome with better tools. It isn't a bug. It is, in fact, the very nature of complexity itself. It's what we are trying to understand.
Exactly. This reframing, seeing complexity as epistemic coupling, doesn't magically eliminate the challenges or puzzles of dealing with complex systems. But it dissolves many of the conceptual puzzles by revealing them as artifacts, as byproducts of those problematic realist and representationalist assumptions.
So, of course, experts and novices enact different complexities.
Of course, different tools reveal different varieties.
Of course, complexity is context-dependent and boundaries are fuzzy.
Of course, interventions have unpredictable effects. These are not problems to be solved by finding the one true map. They're inherent features of how complexity actually works when understood as an emergent, relational, enacted phenomenon.
They're not glitches in our understanding that need fixing. They're fundamental truths about the world we co-create through our distinctions and interactions.
Precisely.
It's really quite humbling, isn't it, to fully realize that we exist in language, we use language for our explanations, for making our distinctions, and that the environment as we perceive it, the world as we know it and navigate it, is in a very real and profound sense our invention, or maybe a co-invention, a co-creation between us and whatever is out there beyond our distinctions.
It is humbling, but also empowering, I think, because once we truly grasp this, once we understand our participatory role, we can begin to engage more consciously, more skillfully, perhaps more wisely with this ongoing process of world-making that we cannot avoid participating in anyway.
We're doing it whether we realize it or not.
Exactly. So we might as well do it consciously. This perspective teaches us that we don't need to reject useful tools like Ashby space wholesale. That would be foolish. But we must understand their proper role as temporary scaffolding for thinking, as heuristics, as ways to provoke new questions and new distinctions, rather than seeing them as permanent structures of truth that dictate what reality is or what is possible. It fundamentally transforms our relationship with knowledge itself, making it more dynamic, more pragmatic, more responsible.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what does this all mean for you, the listener, as you navigate your own complex world, your work, your life, your communities? This journey has revealed that.
I think it reveals that the core challenge is perhaps not ultimately to model the world perfectly, as if it were separate from us waiting to be mapped.
Yeah.
The deeper challenge is to participate in it more wisely, more ethically, more effectively.
And that participation depends on?
That participation depends fundamentally on understanding that complexity emerges from epistemic coupling, that recursive, dynamic interaction between knowing systems, like us, our teams, our organizations, and their domains of inquiry, their environments.
And this understanding makes us responsible.
It makes us responsible not just for our actions in the world, but for the very worlds those actions, those distinctions, help bring forth. It's a profound call to conscious, reflective participation in the ongoing creation of reality.
That was truly a deep dive, just fascinating. It really reconfigures how we might think about the world around us and our role in it. If you, listening, are eager to explore more of Harish's insightful work, you can find him online at harish'snotebook.wordpress.com.
That's harish'snotebook.wordpress.com. Highly recommended reading.
And for those interested in joining a vibrant community of learners and thinkers grappling with these kinds of ideas, Harish is an active member of Cybersyn. You can find exclusive resources there, books, podcasts, active forums, a great place to continue the conversation.
That's Cybersyn, spelled CYB3RSYN. The number 3 in the middle, CYB3RSYN.
Excellent. So just remember, as you go about your week, the world isn't just out there static, waiting to be discovered like a finished product. It's continually being brought forth, enacted, co-created through our interactions, our distinctions, our assumptions, and our choices.
What incredible power that gives us.
And what incredible responsibility. Keep asking questions, keep making new distinctions, keep noticing the assumptions behind your tools, and keep participating wisely in the making of your world.
Well said.
Until next time, keep diving deep.